The vignettes come to my mind when I'm thinking about chemistry and the kind of vignettes that I use to find my vocation. But I also like to think about what is the difference. I mean, what makes me a chemist? You know, Dr. Hunter, a biologist, Dr. Lindbergh, a physicist. We're all definitely talking about the same world, right? But we talk about it in different ways. And it's not just a matter of we zoom into different amounts, although that's probably part of it. But I'd like you to think about the difference in thinking that you get from a biology class versus a physics class versus a chemistry class. And what the disciplinary, well, honestly, the disciplinary biases, the disciplinary priorities, the different ways that you want to put it, those, we just look at the world a different way. And it's really interesting, actually, when you get into the philosophy realm, the philosophy of science and the history of science, because it's all mixed up and you can kind of like draw lines, but then history and life will jump over the lines that you've drawn and things like that. You know, and being a biochemist, I definitely do appreciate biology and I appreciate the physics. I'm teaching a physical chemistry class. It might be my favorite class to teach right now. So I would just like to talk about the kind of vignettes that I would write, and I've got a few questions for you as we go along. So first of all, the question of, now, at the time, I didn't really realize that this would become one of the stories that I'd be sitting here telling you, you know, decades later. At the time, it seemed like a small thing, but looking back on it, I realized that this was one of the first points where I sort of heard a calling. And I heard a calling to explain stuff, to be a science teacher. What it was is I was actually in my cousin's class in Virginia. I don't even remember how old I was. I think I might have been fourth or fifth grade or something like that. And I grew up in Florida. So I grew up where the space shuttles launched. I was actually just talking to Dr. Lindbergh about how I actually saw the Challenger disaster in 1986. I was in sixth grade and I was out on the tarmac. We were all watching the first teacher to fly into space. And of course, we didn't know that it would be one of those iconic days that you remember where you were when you heard. So I was in Florida, and I was in the Space Coast is what they called it. I actually ended up working at Cape Kennedy for one summer between college and high school as for McDonnell Douglas. So I've seen space shuttle launches, and it just seemed like an ordinary part of my life. So during some spring break in Virginia, my cousin, we didn't have anything else to do. My cousins were going to school, so I was like, I don't remember whose idea it was. It probably wasn't mine, but it was the idea of why don't you go along to your cousin's school and sit through the class with him. I remember two things. I remember that the cafeteria was different. It's always exciting to be in a different cafeteria. It always seems like the better food is in your cousin's cafeteria rather than yours. So I remember it seeming like it was a cool cafeteria. And I also remember sitting in one of his classes, and the teacher asked, okay, can anyone tell me how a satellite works? And of course, I'm like Hermione, okay? So I have my hand up right away. And she was like, who's this strange kid? Who are you doing here? But then I'm like, yeah, well, the satellites are up in the air, and if you want to like talk from one place to another, you can send the signal up to the satellite, and you can send it down here, you know. And to me, it was like the most straightforward thing in the world. Of course, everyone knows that's what satellites do because it was the industry that I grew up in. And then like everyone was quiet and like looking around, and they were kind of like, how do you know so much? You know, who are you who is so versed in the ways of science? And you know, it's to me, it was completely transparent. But I also enjoyed doing it, not because I actually didn't like the attention. I was embarrassed by it. But I liked the fact that I had told someone something that was clear to me that was not clear to them before. And now they all remember how satellites work, maybe. Okay. So that was, looking back on it, that was a calling. And it was a little event. And like I said, I didn't think about it even for a couple of decades. And then I realized I like to explain. You know, I like to teach. Well, what's that? It actually took me a really long time to figure out that teaching would be the best way to be explaining the most stuff to people who are right there with you most of the time. I didn't even realize that I wanted to go to grad school until I was a senior, until my last year of school. So I went to the University of Florida, And that's the Gators, for those of you at the other side of the country, not the Seminoles. It's like confusing the Cougars and the Huskies if you do that. But University of Florida, and I decided that I actually wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to go to journalism school because they had a public relations technical communications major. And I'm like, that's how you explain things. And I wanted to be a science writer. Do you know which magazine I wanted to write for? I think it's still around on the web. And want to guess what science magazine I thought was really cool that I wanted to write for? Anybody want to guess? Not Scientific American. Has anyone even heard of Discover magazine anymore? It used to be really cool, and I still remember some things from it. So I wanted to write for Discover magazine, the glamorous life of a science journalist. But I liked that whole idea. Actually, Isaac Asimov was one of the people who showed me that you could write about nonfiction in that way. And he really inspired me. He taught me a lot of physics at the same time. So I went through, and but at the same time, a really weird thing happened to me, is that I kept taking chemistry classes, and I kept doing well in them without really making it a priority. I didn't realize sometimes the thing that you should do is invisible to you because it's just like your way of thinking just fits with it, and so you go for it. And I know that not everyone, in fact, not most people, fit with chemistry that way, but hopefully there's something along the line somewhere that you fit with like that. And my one comment about it is it might be difficult for you to see it. And that's why a process of self-reflection is actually helpful. Not because it's like some kind of goal that you have to build yourself up to, but in a sense you have to kind of get yourself out of the way and see, I didn't really want to be like a chemist, like the stereotypical chemist, but I kept doing it, and it turns out that I realized that I liked it, except for lab. I actually was one of those people who, I didn't really mind it, but it seemed like a waste of time, and so I'd try to get out as fast as I could. So when sometimes I see some students doing that, and I'm okay with it as long as you're safe and doing things thoroughly, because I understand, not all the labs that we do are of equal obvious importance. So I thought that I would be a science writer, so therefore I was in the journalism building a lot. But I kept taking chemistry classes, and then I realized, at first I was like, I'll get a chemistry minor. And then I kept on doing well in the chemistry classes. Our organic professor, by the way, literally brought out like a little laughing box, a wind-up laughing box when he would hand back tests. And he would always hand his back to me and said, you could do better. And I looked and I'd missed like 2 questions. And so he was that kind of guy. You guys don't know how good you have it with Bartlett. So. But I first thought chemistry minor, then I'm like, hey, I'll just get a chemistry major and we'll go through with it. Hey, I'll do summer research just because there's a good program and I want to stay in town. And then on grad school, that same organic chemistry professor, who really was a softie deep down underneath it, although he was kind of a jerk sometimes, he gave a talk at the student ACS, and they said free pizza. And I think I just went for the pizza, But then he pointed out that they paid you to go to grad school. And I'm kind of like, well, I've got this chemistry degree, and what better way to learn how to explain things than to go to grad school and actually do science? Not to mention, I really actually still liked doing science. I just didn't get that many chances to do it when I was an undergrad. And so, thanks to the free pizza, I started looking to grad schools, and I realized that there's the area of biochemistry that really appealed to me, because it had it had cool chemistry, cool physics, and a really good biological purpose, like drug design and pharmacy and things like that. And so that's when I ended up actually applying to grad school and going in for it. So there's the question of why does this chemistry kind of fit with the way that I think about things? And that's kind of a big and broad question. But I'd like to turn the question around and ask you first. What is the difference between chemistry and biology or physics? Okay, so let's focus on chemistry since that's what I do. What is the most chemistry lab that you have done? The one that you say, this is the center of what chemistry is. Any ideas? The most chemistry lab. I know you've all taken a lot of chemistry labs. Alexandra. Okay. Probably took 4 hours, and you're doing a bunch of, or maybe it wasn't one of the 4-hour labs, so that's good. So just a bunch of titrations, and you were determining something. What was the goal? Yeah, and to do it a lot of times and do it really accurately, right? So to measure, that's, I think, one of the primary goals of chemistry. Yeah, anyone else?
I think one of the most chemistry labs that I've done, chemistry like labs that I've done are cold labs, where you're just given an unknown substance and you use all you know.
Mm-hmm.
Chemistry know, just figure out what's inside that vial.
Yeah. Which class are you thinking of when you think of that?
Well, OChem 3
Mm-hmm.
that I'm taking right now.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
That's this lab where it's given unknown vials. Not even a list of compounds to choose from, either it's just a 400-page book to go through to see what might be.
Yeah. So depending on how you look at it, 400-page book, oh my goodness, 400-page book, well, here's a program that I can use to take this apart. And it's a little bit like taking apart, you know, a modeled car or something like that, except that you're analyzing it as you take it apart. And so that shows up in Organic 3. It also shows up in 1213 lab, which is 2213 lab that you all. Qualitative analysis is one of the centers of chemistry. Yeah. So that's definitely making stuff, measuring stuff. QA is a huge part of chemistry. How about biology? What would you say, if somebody asked you to say, what is the most biology lab experience? Which lab exercise comes to mind for you? Learning. Okay. So you had the life, growth, and death, but it's very small life. So you picked a microbial example. I wouldn't have picked that going into college, but now, from being in biochemistry, I very much think of that as biology, right? I mean, a lot of people think biology is all about studying kittens and puppies and things like that, and yeah, that's part of it. You know, I wonder if one of my boys who loves animals is going to be a biologist, but the biologists think differently because it's about the outcome of life and death, and it's those categories, which are very different from chemical categories of analysis. Although they're both complex mixtures, right? You know, there's a lot of things going on. Anybody, what about a physics lab? What would you say is the most physics of physics labs? Actually, I've taken fewer of these than the other ones, so I have fewer examples myself, although I could use physical chemistry, in which I have a story about how I once accidentally made chlorine gas, but that's another story. I'll tell you another time. Let's just say to be very careful which unknown you put in the bomb calorimeter. Okay? I put the wrong one in. It made chlorine. So any thoughts about physics? What makes a physicist think differently than a chemist? Why should somebody go into physics? We just got an example in the news, right? The black hole picture that we got. That's all physics for you. And that's what physics can do. It can image something from far away. So let me ask you about that black hole picture, because I think it tells you about what physics is. What's one characteristic of the black hole picture that you may have heard of that you would say says that this is definitely a physics project and not a chemistry, or definitely not a biology project, right? What makes it physics? Yep. Okay. So it's about light. Yeah, and the chemists definitely, we use light as energy, you know, but we definitely don't deal with space-time continuum warped enough to break into a black hole or with singularity, whatever it is. I've got to be careful to say my terms correctly because we do have a physicist who thinks that way very well. So, yeah, that's what they're measuring. I want you to think about what you've heard about how the physics was done. I know that you've all seen stuff about it. So what did you see that would be how the science is done, not necessarily even what the science is about? Yeah. Does anybody know how long it took? So that's 98 years. Not quite 100. But to actually observe something that was predicted 98 years ago. Did anyone see the meme about it? There's been a bunch of memes. In fact, there's been a little bit of a war of memes going on. The thing about the meme is that there are people in positions of leadership, and one of them is Katie Bowen, and there are people that are on a huge team. And so it's hard to put a face on that. You've got to put a face on that and tell the stories of people like Dr. Bauman, who has just gotten an assistant professorship job, but she also was in a place of leadership. And people are fighting about how much did she do, when it's clear at the end of the day she did a lot. And you know, it's like, I just want to encourage you to ignore the smoke and look for the real fire of what's going on. An amazing picture that was spearheaded by a huge team of a lot of talented people. John? Yeah. Right. Right. Not even the stuff at CERN or, you know, these calculations, LIGO, and things like that. Okay, so the thing is, why would you, if you, working in physics requires some kind of teamwork that actually working in chemistry does not. Working in biology, you know, Eric Long, when he goes out to the island and tackles deer, there's definitely collaboration going on, but it's not the same kind of thing as the team who found the black hole. Different skills, and there's different areas, and within the different disciplines, there's different areas for you to look at. So I want to ask the question of, why did I end up in chemistry? There's a little bit of a, it's not like I set my goal, I'm not like Katie Bauman, who set her goal on working on black holes because they really inspired her. That's great for her. For me, it just worked out differently. And I sort of fell into it, like you might expect from my story about not even wanting to necessarily go to grad school until I found out that they would pay for it. But one of the other factors, when I was looking at grad programs, I had taken biochemistry, and I really liked protein structures. They looked like big Legos to me. And it's kind of cool. You know, it's really complex. There's a lot of stuff going on, but here's a protein that basically works as a cup. And the thing that it binds just sits in the cup like this, and the thing in the middle of it is iron, an important chemical from the periodic table. So this ties together chemistry and Legos. The other area of chemistry that's important that we didn't mention that really inspired me was the area of structure. I even like the organic chemistry structure and thinking about how that stuff rotates. It was one of the reasons why I got through organic chem with a big emphasis on structure. And so I found that out about myself. I had a very idiosyncratic chemistry teacher when I was in high school named Mr. Pekich. He was very organized, and he would also have chemistry competitions, and I like to win things, and so I would make it my goal to win those competitions, even though, you know, I thought chemistry was cool, but I wasn't like in love with it like Katie Bauman is with black holes. I keep coming back to her because people have been asking her, why do you do this, you know? But I still did, I guess there's a little bit of that, you know, falling in love with it when I see those structures. And again, I realize that I'm teaching a bunch of students who have all sorts of different reactions to it. But find your thing, you know, the thing that sort of pulls you through, whether you see it or not. And that is part of your vocation. Your vocation is always going to include something that comes naturally to you and something that challenges you. So don't be surprised also when there's something that's a real challenge. So when I look back and I think about people who thought like this, who made things, who measured things, or who built things out of chemistry, out of atoms. Those are the chemists, and I'd like to mention just 6 short vignettes from history of the chemists that inspired me. So I'll start off, I'm going to sort of move forward in time. John Dalton and John Winthrop Jr. Actually, technically John Winthrop, I should have started with him, but I started with John Dalton just because I forgot that that was the actual order. So let's start with him. He started atomic theory. He was the first guy to really say everything's made out of atoms, and there's this important atom called carbon and this other one called oxygen and things like that. So he was the first guy to really put together modern atomic theory. And there's one story about him that I can't find it anymore, but there's some story about how he was elected to the Royal Society, which is like not quite winning a Nobel Prize, but getting up there. And when he was elected, like they wanted to come and tell him in person. And so they came to him in person. There's these important people from the Royal Society, but he had a class to teach. And so they showed up like right as he was starting his class. And they're like, oh, we've got something important to tell you. And he's like, wait until the end of class. And he like went around and he was like in a small school, like tutoring students, like helping them with their math problems or whatever. And he made them wait. And he was just that kind of guy. You know, he was, it really says to me, that's got your priorities straight. Another way in which he had his priorities interestingly straight is he was colorblind, red-green colorblind, still called Daltonism at a certain level. And he had a theory that the fluid inside his eyes was the wrong color. It was absorbing the light that would allow him to make a difference between red and green. And so he had a hypothesis, he had a prediction. He didn't want to mess with his own eyes. There's a long history of scientists messing with their own eyes. Newton actually like stuck a needle next to his eye to do experiments. I'm glad that we're past that stage. That would not be me. But he valued his eyes, so he donated them to science, though. And he said, when I'm dead, cut them open and say which color they are. And he was wrong. They were just the same color as everything else. The problem was not in the vitreous fluid inside the eye. However, it had a surprising end to this story, because the eyes have DNA, and of course they preserve them, because, I mean, you've got John Dalton's eyes that you cut open for science. You better put that in some formaldehyde and just wait, because you never know what will happen. Well, it turns out, you know, more than 100 years later, they developed PCR technology, and they went in and they looked for John Dalton's. They had figured out that color blindness is caused by a defective opsin gene in many cases. And they wanted to find out if Dalton was the major cause of color blindness. So they went in and they sequenced his DNA, and they found out, lo and behold, yeah, he was missing the opsin, just like they predicted. So he wasn't right, but he was able to eventually prove the biologist right by donating his eyes to science. So be an organ donor. You never know what will happen, okay? This is the whole story. It's actually the mid-90s where they did it, and it's a green opsin that he had. So to jump back in time accidentally, because I put this in the wrong order, John Winthrop Jr. was actually in the latter part of the 16th century. So there's a question, is he really a chemist or is he an alchemist? Now I'm personally of the opinion that alchemy had a lot more to it than people think. There were a lot of charlatans, there were a lot of snake oil doctors who were just promised the king that they would make him a lot of gold, and so the king kept him around, and the experiments always were 5 years away from working. By the way, that still happens. There's always experiments that are 5 years away from working that you'll read about today. But the alchemists were really a sketchy lot overall, and they would mix in spirituality and like things with experiments. But I think there's actually some good parts of it that people overlook today. And here's one part of it. He was governor of the Connecticut colony, and he was actually the doctor for 1/10 of Connecticut's families. He basically was doctor for 500 people in his spare time. Now, he actually, it was sort of borderline alchemy chemistry. It wasn't exactly drug design, right? But some of these things actually work. Some of the folk remedies actually work. And like, you know, I don't think today we burn and pulverize toads anymore to combat the plague, but, you know, at least it was a step in the right direction. And the most important thing, when you look at all this, I don't have the quote right here, but he would refuse payment. He believed, because of his faith, he believed that a doctor should not accept payment from a patient because he believed that all the healing did not come from him. I mean, it's pretty clear that if you have pulverized toads, it's not all coming from him, okay? He actually believed that the healing was just sort of an opening for God to work. It was getting things out of the way so that God could heal. And that's a very deep theological reason. Now, I don't propose that we follow him 100% in any of this today, but I think it's kind of a different way of looking at medicine rather than the high prestige, the way to serve. And I like the idea of opening up a path for God to heal, because that's a lot of what doctors are doing, really. You can say a lot about rational drug design, but you can say that not everything is rational drug design either. So I encourage you, if you're pre-med, to consider that change in attitude. And when you're volunteering, you can say to yourself, well, at least I'm following in the steps of Dr. Winthrop, okay? So there's another couple of sort of heroes that I have. There's Justus von Liebig, who is actually the founder of organic chemistry. And so this was his lab. It kind of looks a little bit like a chemistry lab, no fume hoods. But some of the bottles and some of the way things are arranged kind of look like your organic chemistry lab. He brought that together. He not only was the first to really do organic chemistry the way that we do it today, he also insisted that you shouldn't just teach people stuff, you should have them do stuff. And so that's one of my inspirations for, I totally agree that undergraduates, you should actually be doing something. One of the things I didn't like about my labs growing up was that, I knew they'd just throw it away. I was being assessed, and how well could I separate these things? That's great. But I didn't really have much motivation. What if I was actually finding something out that no one had actually found out before? Because isn't that the point of science? He had the same exact attitude, and he was at the beginning of chemistry. I want to point out there's a cool infographic. It's actually much bigger than this. This is a section of it. If you're interested in infographics and design, I encourage you to look up the whole thing. But right here, only a few apart from each other, are two models that I would like to put out, Dorothy Hodgkin and Barbara McClintock. Dorothy Hodgkin was a crystallographer, which is definitely finding the structure, and that's the area that I went into, X-ray crystallography. Now, she was working on things like penicillin and vitamin B12. She's a Nobel laureate, and there's an interesting kind of question. What kind of thinker was she to be in this field, and why were there so many women in crystallography at a time, if you think about it, Rosalind Franklin? She was totally spurned and passed over and should have been able to get a lot more credit than she did. Why was she a crystallographer in the first place, though? There's an argument that crystallography was actually a combination of physics, chemistry, and biology that tend to actually involve multiple disciplines even beyond that. And because of that, you needed to have people who were flexible in their thinking and people who may have been, the doors may have been closed to them to go into the pure disciplines, right? And so there's the argument that a lot of women, because doors were closed to them elsewhere, were able to move into this. And a lot of them had computational experience, and they were able to use that in the field as well. So nascent computer science. One minute you're talking to a virologist, next to a crystallographer, next to an immunologist. It's still a collaborative science because you're using physics techniques on chemical samples to determine biological purposes and structures. This is a story from her early days. Like, you have to learn symmetry operations to do crystallography. Well, she already knew it, not because she had this direct path toward grad school, but because her parents, they were both scholars, but they were archaeologists. And she was illustrating floor tilings, and it turns out that that's a two-dimensional crystal. And the symmetry operations you do to do different floor tilings, that's exactly similar, analogous to the three-dimensional ways that crystals form. So that multidisciplinary way of looking at things was really cool about Dorothy Hodgkin. Also, she had friends who were outside of science. For example, this is one of her pictures of the insulin structure, another thing that she was very much involved in. she had a friend who was in design, and that friend had wallpaper. Said, I don't know who had the idea first, but one of them eventually said, wouldn't these be cool wallpaper designs? So again, a symmetric sort of arrangement, and she sort of put these together, but it's an example of who would have thought that you could put insulin on an insulin crystal structure onto wallpaper and get something that people would actually watch. You know, you can stylize it more or less. There is a whole museum exhibit that I literally stumbled upon when I was in London that I bought the book for. It's called From Atoms to Patterns, and it's about how crystallography inspired design in many ways. Very cool stuff. So keep your eyes open. You can see this is hemoglobin, and I have another bunch of examples, but they were put on fabrics as well as wallpapers. Very interdisciplinary. The other thing I want to think about is Barbara McClintock, who actually asked a question no one else was asking, and that's what inspires me about her, when she looked at corn kernels. So these colors that are colors in the corn, they're different in every kernel. Why are they different? And how does that get passed on from generation to generation? Most people would say, oh, it's just something in the chemistry. But it's actually something in the biochemistry. It's something in the DNA. There's actually differences in the genes where genes are transposed in different corn plants in heritable patterns. The genes are literally knit together, like cut and pasted from one place to another. And so you had the transposition that no one really believed in, because it really seems like DNA, that's just way too wacky for DNA to do. But she just started with a simple question, and she went after it. And she did have to endure a lot of skepticism before she eventually won the Nobel Prize herself in 1983. But I love that idea of starting with a simple observation that no one else is seeing and pushing through to find a way that DNA works that no one else can see. The placement of the transposons is what causes the color of the kernel to change. It's a literal DNA movement, same kind of DNA movement that is involved in antibiotic resistance. So like, how would you predict that? And now we can use that. It's related to all the ways that we can now move DNA around the same way. If I had to pick one, then I would have to pick R.J.P. Williams. And this is something that I'm just going to give the barest sketch because this literally inspired me to write a book. And my book does not have that much original thinking. I'm more of a synthesizer than I am thought experiment type person. But this gave me, he gave me the basic idea for what to synthesize things around. Now he did a bunch of stuff. He was at Merton College in Oxford, and then he moved to Wadham College in Oxford. He actually was made a member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, which sounds like a great recognition until you find out it was for developing parkland, not for his science. But he was a great scientist and somewhat overlooked. I found out that when they were having a symposium on who should have won a Nobel, who didn't. Rosalind Franklin, right up there, right? He was also up there. And there's a question of why was he never really nominated for a Nobel? And there's an argument that he was actually involved in too much. He was sort of a jack of all trades, master of none. Whereas to win a Nobel, you got to have one thing on that Nobel Prize. And so this is an example of some of the things that he does. In Biochemistry 1, for those of you who have been through that challenge, okay, there's a part where I talk about how iron 2 and iron 3 have different sizes, and that has to do with how hemoglobin works. It's ringing a little bit of a bell. That all comes from R.J.P. Williams. He developed that, and he started with the inorganic chemistry of this atom on the periodic table, and the orbitals and stuff that's like really hard to understand mathematically, physical chemistry type stuff, and then he brought it out to biochemistry. I think that's really cool, and he also had the idea that chemistry is a fundamental constraint on evolution. And he made some predictions that then I went back and I found other scientists had backed up those predictions. And actually he noticed that himself and he wrote the books, but he is the hardest author I have ever had to read, okay? He has this book, which is one of the foundational books, but it seriously took me forever to read this book, The Chemistry of Evolution. And I had to get used to his writing style. It's so dense. And, but it's really good. So I recommend this, but make sure you have time. And I don't recommend him as a writer, honestly. But that's one of the things I wanted to do. I wanted to sort of explain his ideas, bring them up to date, talk about how other scientists had confirmed what he predicted. And I had the publication dates to prove it. He was predicting this stuff before they confirmed it. So that's his trajectory. This is the classic text in inorganic chemistry. And you see there he is right there, R.J.P. Williams. But then he started, toward the end of his life, he started thinking big picture. And he had sort of interesting books, Natural Selection of the Chemical Elements. You have a biological term and then a chemical term put together. Bringing chemistry to life, the chemistry of evolution. And then, right before he died, he published this book, Evolution's Destiny, which is actually too strong for even me to say right now. But it's a very provocative thing to come from an agnostic, almost Nobel Prize-winning chemist. What does he mean that evolution actually has a destiny? So there's a bunch of papers that people, he was a really big influence on a lot of people. When I went to the convention, I started talking about him, like everybody was like, oh yeah, he's really cool. But no one knows this outside of chemistry. And so part of what I wanted to do with my book is sort of talk about him. And so that's what my book is. It's a translation. The path to this book, it's not like I sat out and said, I'm going to write a book one day. First I did the Weider Lecture, which is an award lecture given here at SPU. Then I worked it into my physical chemistry lectures, and it came out of my physical chemistry lectures that I was like, hey, why don't I write this into a book? And also, if we're talking about collaborating in teams, this book was done in collaboration with 2 artists. Together, they made 40 images for the book, which is, I think, a huge part of that book. And also, I asked if they could be on the cover, but apparently you got to put dolphins on the cover. You don't put other people's names on the cover. You have a surprising little amount of control over the final product sometimes. One last thing. Notice that Williams was at Merton College. And I looked up the years. And when he was an undergrad, this guy was teaching Beowulf. So J.R.R. Tolkien very probably taught R.J.P. Williams about English. And did they meet? I'm still looking for evidence of that, but this is the kind of thing. They both walked under this tree at Merton College. And this is an actual tree, like outside the building where Tolkien taught. So when he's thinking of the Ents and Fangorn Forest and whatever else is going on, he's thinking of trees like this. And I just think that that's the kind of cool overlap that you can find out when you look into history and see people. I have a lot of sympathy for J.R.R. Tolkien. He had 4 kids. And so, yeah, I'm there with him. I know what it's like. And he also was an academic. He was always worried about making ends meet, actually. He didn't have the big publishing success until late in life. And also a committed Christian through it all, even though not a lot of people know Lord of the Rings has several Christian references in them. Very buried and very much done his way is what he wanted to. There's an unmistakable one. There's an unmistakable group of references like that. So, my final thing is that these vignettes are all about historical chemical models. And when I say that, you want to think that models can be models of personality as well as models of atoms. And so I just want to encourage you to think about history, learn about history, as you're thinking about your own vignettes to put things in perspective, because it certainly has helped me. All right, that's our time for today. If you have any questions, you're welcome to come up and talk to me afterwards. Thank you for your time, and we are dismissed.